I've been kindly invited to talk to you today about political cosmopolitanism and world order, week 8 in the module, justice and order.
Order and justice.
Order and justice. And I think I'm also going to be here next week as well, except that we've got the validation for the master's course, so I've asked them to let me out for this time, but I'm not 100% sure that I will be here next week, but hopefully I will. So, political cosmopolitanism. I notice you have a couple of readings. I'm sure the rest of the reading list is somewhere else. And I know that you don't have your seminar on the topic until next week, so you might not have been thinking about cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan democracy. But just in case you have been thinking about it, if you have any questions, you can sort of raise them now. Has anyone done any reading? Has anyone heard of cosmopolitan democracy? No? Yeah? And some of you have. And has anyone done any of the reading? I know that you often do the reading after the lectures, which to me doesn't make that much sense. I think you'd get more out of the lectures if you did a little bit of reading beforehand. But I know that everyone does their own thing differently. So did anyone have a look at either of the readings beforehand? The readings in your module guides. Anyway, one of the readings is something by me that I wrote about 10 years ago. And the other reading is something by Daniele Archibugi, which he wrote over 10 years ago. And so maybe that tells you something that, it may tell you something, it may not, but it may tell you that debates on cosmopolitan democracy were mainly done in the past, about 10 years ago, in the 90s, in the mid-90s and the late 90s. And so for some reason we spend a bit less time talking about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan democracy today. You might want to think about why that was, that something may have changed in the 90s that made us think about the world in terms of cosmopolitanism, and then something else may have changed after the 90s that makes us less likely to think about the world in terms of cosmopolitanism. So when we're thinking about ideas and concepts, it's often useful to think about them in a context, that even though you might read that ideas of cosmopolitanism are universal and timeless and have been around since Alexander the Great or the Stoics or something like that, it seems clear that there's more to it than just some universal ideas of one big community in a cosmopolitan way of engaging with politics and society. It seems that we also have to think about why something about those timeless ideas spoke to us in the 90s and how those ideas were given a particular shape and a particular content. And I know in your question, your seminar task, you're asked about the particular content, the practical, material manifestation of 90s cosmopolitanism. It says, what are the institutional manifestations of cosmopolitanism within the international system? So I guess that question is asking about certain institutional practices that developed in the 90s or came out of the 90s, which maybe are around today. So that's one way of thinking about cosmopolitanism. Now, I can't tell you about that because that's a question for your task for the seminar. But when we discuss cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan democracy, it shouldn't be too difficult to think about institutional manifestations that developed after the end of the Cold War that we thought would be cosmopolitan. But I think the other way of thinking about ideas that developed in the 90s, and particularly when you do some reading, if you do some reading about cosmopolitan democracy, is that they're engaged very much in a set of debates and a set of problems that are quite specific to the 90s, at different levels. And one key, different levels concerning order and justice, which is why it's a key lecture for your module. And one of the key concerns in the 90s about order and justice was issues of sovereignty and intervention, which I'm sure you've covered on numerous occasions in this module and maybe in other modules on international relations. But there was something around those key issues of sovereignty and intervention that many of the writers on cosmopolitan democracy sought to engage with. When you read the Archiboogie chapter, it's available. It's a shame you haven't looked at the readings. I'm sure, are they just available through the library electronically?
They should be on Blackboard.
Oh, they're available on Blackboards. Okay. So when you look at the Archiboogie chapter or the article in New Left Review, you'll see that he's very much concerned with issues of humanitarian intervention, issues of sovereignty, issues of international order and justice, and something about the problems of the world in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, that was seen as a barrier to order and justice, to which cosmopolitan democracy, or political cosmopolitanism, was seen as a possible answer. So that's like a very real set of policy and academic debates that people that are talking about cosmopolitanism were engaging with. But for you, or for us today, maybe it's sort of wrong to be too focused on the immediate context and the immediate debates of the 90s. Because also there was a broader set of debates and problems that were being negotiated in the 90s and are still being discussed today. And those were broader concerns about democracy itself, and about politics, and about representation. And when we read a little bit more deeper into ideas of cosmopolitan democracy, if that was possible, but there isn't another reading list, is there?
No.
No. So fortunately I brought some books along so that I could share them with you and tell you about them. But if you were to read a bit deeper into cosmopolitan democracy, there's also a broader set of debates, and those debates are about order and justice more broadly, and about a feeling that our traditional understandings of liberal modernity, the traditional ways that we do politics, the traditional ways that we organise doing politics inside states in a territorially framed way, and the way that we articulate political concerns and interests, that there was something problematic about that. That regardless of the issues of humanitarian intervention and sovereignty and the formal or limited nature of international law and the UN Charter, that there was a broader problem of states and sovereignty as frameworks in which we did politics and as frameworks in which we gave democratic legitimacy to certain policies and ideas. So I think if you were doing the reading, there's like at least two contexts to bear in mind when we're talking about cosmopolitanism. One is the immediate and narrow idea of order and justice in international relations in the face of genocide and humanitarian crisis and the boundaries of sovereignty, the limitations of the UN Charter and international law. And the second context is a broader discussion about the limits of liberalism, or the limits of representational democracy, the limits and one-sidedness and restrictions of just doing democracy inside states. And that broader context is normally reflected upon in an understanding of the world as globalized. That there's something about the post-Cold War world and globalization that makes us think in a cosmopolitan way, that makes us think about politics beyond nation states, and makes us think about how we can organize to address political problems outside of that framework. So that's the broader concern. It's normally posed, as I say, in the context of a world becoming globalized, and therefore our identities and our understandings, our political concerns, the way we might organize politically, are seen as not necessarily restricted to organizing inside states and organizing in terms of gaining state power or winning elections or organizing policies on a state-based framework. Yeah, so that's like a second thing. The idea of globalization and how that impacts on our identities and our political activities. So then I guess the third thing is what I'd already alluded to about the limits of liberalism, liberal modernity, and representation more broadly. So maybe that's a useful framework of three different issues working out from the immediacy of policies of humanitarian intervention, how we might do that in a world of states which seem to be very keen to defend traditional sovereign rights, then a sort of rethinking about how do we deal with global problems in a globalized world, and is international policy making on the basis of states the only way of addressing those global, broader questions? And then, on a third level, a most broad level, the broader critique and the rethinking of liberal modernity and our ways of understanding politics and all the traditional liberal binaries. We might want to argue, I don't want to get too technical on you, but we might want to argue that cosmopolitan democracy and its way of going beyond our traditional frameworks of doing politics and of going beyond traditional frameworks of representation might question certain binaries like the difference between the inside and the outside, the domestic and the international. It's quite possible that what we call a liberal cosmopolitanist approach would argue that that sort of division is unnecessary and unhelpful. And it's also quite possible that a liberal cosmopolitan approach might argue that other liberal binaries or traditional classical divisions of liberal modernity are also unhelpful, like the division between the public sphere and the private sphere. Our understanding that politics not only just takes place inside states, but that politics has to take place in this formalized and artificial sphere, somehow separate to economic and social relations. If you were to read someone, even someone like David Held, have you come across David Held? Yeah. He's less famous now than he used to be, but he used to work at the London School of Economics and be in charge of their global governance issues. And if you were to read, I'll tell you some of the books, but you could also argue that that idea of cosmopolitanizing democracy, rethinking our traditional understandings, we also want to rethink the division between the public and the private, and think about how democracy needs to be spread not just outside states and into the international sphere, but also to be spreading deeper within domestic society as well, that we're embedded in a complex set of different social relations where we might need to rethink democracy and think about how democracy might work in the family, in the workplace, at different levels and in different frameworks and in different systems. That democracy, or what we call politics, shouldn't just be at this top artificial level in terms of a vertical understanding, And it shouldn't just be organised in little boxes of states in terms of a horizontal understanding. So when we're thinking about cosmopolitan democracy, as I've argued, we shouldn't see it merely in terms of pragmatism, of how do we authorise intervention against traditional rights of sovereign states. We should also think of it more broadly as a radical challenge, a radical rethinking of how we understand politics and the spheres in which politics works and the ways in which politics might legitimate or authorise certain understandings. So that's all I've got to say. Not really. So, this is a module on international relations, not political theory. So, one of the most well-known books, if you wanted to look at cosmopolitan democracy, is this book from 1995 by David Held, Democracy and the Global Order.
Sorry, can you spell the author?
Yeah, sorry, Held, H-E-L-D.
Oh, H-E-L-D.
David Held. And he was very much influenced by the work of Anthony Giddens and other sort of radical sociologists. And he brought in some of that radical sociology into international relations. And the thing about sociology, of course, is it doesn't work on all our traditional liberal binaries, and it looks at social processes and how those social processes are reproduced. Anyway, we don't need to worry about Anthony Giddens and his work so much. In terms of international relations, David Held is quite useful to look at. In terms of, and he's still writing and working, mainly more on issues to do with the environment. In the 90s, cosmopolitan Democrats focused on global issues and concerns that they felt a world of states and a world of international law wasn't really able to cope with. And so in the 90s, the main sort of global issue bringing us together as a cosmopolitan community beyond the world of states was that of genocide, humanitarian intervention and conflict. But in the 2000s and onwards, clearly the environment and the biosphere have been our major concerns. And often you'll find cosmopolitan thinkers articulating similar arguments, but not in relation to humanitarian intervention, but in relationship to global warming and how we manage carbon emissions, etc. Anyway, so getting back to this particular book about democracy and the global order, and I think that you'll find that Held is probably the most articulate and developed theorist of cosmopolitan democracy ideas, which is why I'd recommend that you start with him. Anyway, so the issues that he raises, and they're similar to other theorists, Andrew Linklater, Daniela Archibucci, Mary Kaldor, Richard Falk, there's a whole number of people. I'll tell you a bit more about them, maybe if there's time, probably not. Anyway, what they argue is that politics based on states has certain limitations. And the limitations are that the demos is the demos of a strictly territorially limited box. And that thinking about politics inside these boxes of states and sovereignty is a bit limiting. And it's limiting for a whole range of reasons. As they would argue, it's firstly limiting because we don't necessarily feel that our community of interests and concerns is inside of that box. That in our globalized and globalizing world where we move around, we have communications, we have different concerns, it often seems that when we're doing our politics or doing our thinking, that we might be linking up with people outside of that particular territory, or that our concerns aren't within the control of the government that might be elected. That we do our politics outside of those boxes, and that the whole world seems to work outside of those boxes. That economic and social relations are highly interdependent. The issues of disease and conflict and refugees and environmental issues, what they would argue is that the state is too small a way of doing democracy and organising politics when there's all these cross-cutting concerns and global issues in international relations. And also they would argue that on many levels the state is too big, that we don't have a national collective identity in ways that maybe we used to 50 or 60 years ago. That when it comes to politics and representation, our understandings and our connections and our concerns might be much more local, and that we might feel quite alienated if there's a majority that, at the level of the states, but not necessarily at our local level. And it seems that states may be a bit too distant from us, a bit unwieldy. It's not like we're all in political parties that are directly linked to levels of government. In the old days, when there was a much higher level of political party membership, we felt much more engaged in policy discussions at the level of the states. Anyway, so the point that David held and other cosmopolitans make is that it seems a bit arbitrary that all our politics should be organised collectively in these little territorial boxes of the state. That when you consider that our lives and concerns are diverse and spread across a whole range of levels, from the local and the regional up to global concerns, or concerns around specific issues. So that's the first point, that in a complex and globalised, interconnected world, where there's different processes, different engagements, different aspects of our identities being exercised, to squeeze all that in to like elections every 5 years in this territorial box doesn't really seem to enable us to express our voices and our opinions and our concerns. But I think that in terms of international relations, that whole set of problems is probably a secondary set of problems. The main and most immediate set of problems that cosmopolitanism seeks to address is the product of us doing politics inside those territorial boxes. What is produced? So if you think about it, in discourses around elections, political parties that stand on the basis of representing the communities inside those territorial boxes have to say, we're representing your collective interests in a better way than other political parties. So essentially what the electoral competition is a competition to see who can represent the national interest in the best way. And any voices that argue about other concerns or other interests are inevitably marginalised. So for a cosmopolitanism, not only does electoral politics inside states ignore the huge diversity and complexity of our identities and our interests and the way that we organise, it begins to impose a fairly narrow and particularist understanding of what should be the product of democratic politics. The product should be the articulation of national interests in the clearest and most determined way. And in today's world, it seems to us that that's the last thing that we need, a whole set of elected representatives that are really only there because they're the best at saying that they're going to represent or articulate the interests that are developed and mediated and represented in politics organised around the basis of states. That if you think about it, most of our concerns and our interests have got very little to do with these particularist national interests. And that's where I think cosmopolitanism in international relations, particularly bearing in mind the transitional nature of international relations after the end of the Cold War, cosmopolitanism is saying that the way that international law and international politics is organised on the basis of these boxes of nation-states that elect governments that are the strongest advocates of national and particularist community interests, that has to be the worst way possible of thinking about how to organise order and justice in international relations. Now maybe, they might say, if we were still in the Cold War, if we're in the middle of like a life and death armed struggle where we need to mobilise armies and make sacrifices and all the rest of it, maybe there would be some sense in organising politics like that, with this nationalist sense of community and the Blitz spirit and those sorts of things. But clearly, in a post-Cold War period, it seems that that's actually a barrier to thinking about our concerns, not just our own personal political concerns, but also the real concerns of the world, the concerns that we have as global citizens, as members of a planet called Earth. So, what they, in a nutshell then, cosmopolitan Democrats argue that there has to be a better way of thinking about how we structure order and justice in the international sphere than this divisive and particularist set of nationalist politicians that are products of what we call democracy on the basis of territorial states. And one of the key arguments that they said that this has to be wrong, as I've already alluded to, was on the issue of humanitarian intervention, on the issue of, in the chaos of the post-Cold War era, when there's interstate conflicts, the great powers are no longer propping up undemocratic regimes, the former Soviet Union's empire is collapsing, the whole Cold War division of Africa is beginning to be liberalised and opened up, and with that there's a lot of instability and conflict, internal conflict, and also traditional interstate war-type conflict. People are saying that we need an international framework of order and justice that can go beyond this state-based idea, this state-based framework. And one of the biggest problems with states and the United Nations, cosmopolitans would say the United Nations, as it's constituted, is essentially like a trade union for states. It's like all the worst political actors you could ever imagine getting together to argue for their collective interests. And for states, clearly, the collective interest, as a cosmopolitan would understand it, is for these elites that are elected on the basis of how nationalist they are to maintain their power and to maintain their authority and to maintain their legitimacy. So if you get a trade union of states together, they will all argue for sovereignty and the rights of sovereignty. They'll all be against global, cosmopolitan understandings of problems and how we might address them. They'll all be wanting to defend their own particularist interests and defending the boundaries of sovereignty and the rights of sovereignty. And a cosmopolitan would say that in doing that, they're basically giving themselves impunity, and that most of these leaders, many of them aren't even elected very democratically either, that basically traditional international law, laws against intervention, laws that protect the autonomy of sovereignty, just give free rein to dictators, to genocide, and to ethnically cleanse their own populations, to refuse to invest in welfare and a health service, etc. So cosmopolitans would argue that when it comes to important questions, states can't really be trusted. States can't be trusted on their own individually because they'll just be a nationalist discourse, elite will be able to manipulate voting. And states they definitely can't be trusted as the framework of organising to address international problems and international questions. And it seemed in the 90s that the main barrier in terms of the development and the progress of international law and cosmopolitan concerns was the barrier of sovereignty against intervention. So in the 90s, a lot of cosmopolitan Democrats spent a lot of time thinking about another way in which we could authorise and legitimise a framework that could discuss the legitimacy of intervening to prevent genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and human rights abuses. And they felt that if we just left it up to states, then clearly most of them would disagree with any of these advances because they would be seen to be losing out on their own authority and their own power. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what they write about those things. But you can see that in the same way that states were seen as not being able to be trusted when it comes to humanitarian intervention and genocide, in the same way cosmopolitanists today, although I'll go on to how they might be slightly different to the 90s, they would argue that states can't be trusted when it comes to issues of the environment, that there is no demos, no constituted community that is given sort of a political expression and legitimacy around the global concerns of the biosphere, the environment, and global warming. That if all the politicians are elected in terms of national interest, they'll be just putting their own short-term, particularist, national concerns ahead of those of the planet and of the environment and of the long term. And they would particularly argue that the most influential states in the world maybe would have the least to lose from global warming. So that in the same way as we might discuss alternative ways of organising to enable intervention against genocide, people would also argue a similar need to rethink the state-based framework to think about global concerns about the environment. That states can't really be trusted on either of these issues. And it seems that with the end of the Cold War, the general issues of the international sphere and of global politics are those on which states really will just be a barrier. They'll be holding us back when it comes to progress, when it comes to thinking about our collective interests. So with that in mind as a background, so David Held would argue, and Archie Boogie and Calder and other people, they would argue that if we can't trust international law made by states to authorise intervention, what sort of other alternatives are there to think about how we meet the needs of the most vulnerable and marginal people who are at risk of human rights abuses and genocide? And they all have different ideas. Now, so one of your questions in the seminar is about, is it a blueprint, is cosmopolitan democracy a blueprint for an international order, is it realistic, and those sorts of things. So on the first level, you have to realise that cosmopolitan democracy doesn't exist. It's a critique. It's a challenge to the world of international law and international relations. And in making this challenge, people are generally putting forward different alternative suggestions. So it's not as if everyone has the same ideas, it's a clear programme, or there's a huge social movement organised along this sort of platform. These are different ideas by different academics who are all broadly seeking to question what we understand as order and justice and how it's organised in today's world. And so David Held argues that we need cosmopolitan democratic law. And he argues that this is a law that would be different because we don't have a world government. Cosmopolitans don't really want a world government. They don't want a world government for traditional reasons, like Kant and traditional Enlightenment philosophers who would argue that if there was a world government, there'd be no political alternatives, there'd be no right of refuge. What if this world government was dictatorial? You know, where could you go? What could you do? And that therefore we need a plurality of states in order to give us political opportunities and political choices. That's the traditional argument that cosmopolitans might have against a world government. But they also argue, and even Archie Boogie argues it in the little piece that you've got to read of his, he argues that cosmopolitans don't want to reproduce the state on a global level. Because as I've already intimated, their problem isn't just with democracy and how it works and law and how it works internationally. Their problem is also a lot of our liberal understandings of representation and the separation of politics from society and the way in which elections don't necessarily meet the needs of the whole of society, that elections meet the needs of a majority that may be influenced in different ways. So the other reason why they don't want to reproduce the state on a global level is they think that in thinking about the expansion of democracy from being based on states to being based on our global concerns and needs, we're also really transforming what we mean by democracy. We're also going beyond of traditional liberal frameworks of majoritarianism and of representation. So, so what David Held argues, just for example, is that cosmopolitan democratic law, or cosmopolitan international law, isn't the same as domestic law. And the way that cosmopolitan politics would be organised is not the same as just thinking about domestic frameworks of representation and majoritarianism. But he also argues it's not the same as international law as we know it. where states have to agree on an act by consensus. In international law, because there's no sovereign, law isn't about majoritarianism. Everyone has to agree. States only sign up to treaties and are bound by them if they formally agree to it. Anyway, his point is that cosmopolitan law would be different. And that's why David Held is so interesting to read, and he's the most intellectually or conceptually or philosophically developed theorist of cosmopolitan democracy, because he's continually working through how we might understand representation and law and order and justice differently to ways in which it's traditionally been conceived, either on a domestic level or internationally. Anyway, so he argues that basically not all states can take part in cosmopolitan law, that really only democracies should have a say. So therefore he's sort of arguing that if we left the trade unions of the United Nations representing all states, there probably wouldn't be an agreement on humanitarian intervention and preventing genocide. So those states that are more enlightened and more liberal, more open to the rule of law and to human rights and democracy, they should be able to begin to carve out their own framework, their own international norms of what cosmopolitan law might be, and that can be spread as liberal values begin to grow and expand in the post-Cold War period. So cosmopolitans have an idea of law as developing, that not all states are necessarily ready for cosmopolitanism, and that those states that are the most advanced should take an ethical or a moral leadership. Habermas wrote quite a lot around this, around the intervention over Kosovo, that even though the UN Security Council didn't agree, that there was a new cosmopolitan law that was imminent, that through those practices a new ethical and cosmopolitan understanding would be instituted. Other people have a less formalised understanding. Mary Caldor, who was influenced by the same people and also works at the London School of Economics, she wrote this interesting book, Global Civil Society, An Answer to War. Mary Caldor, K-A-L-D-O-R. And what she's essentially arguing is that we live in a global world of struggle, a struggle between two different sets of ideas. One set of ideas is old-fashioned, state-based representational ideas, where we organise politics around state-based national interests and conflict. And another set of ideas develop in the new and expanding space of global civil society. And global civil society's ideas don't develop on the basis of liberal understandings of voting and representation. Global civil society, like civil society domestically, doesn't operate in that high, formalised, artificial level of formal politics of parties and votings and government. It operates at the level of society. And what she argues is that, as opposed to the formalised and narrow understandings of law in terms of international politics, the global civil society, the people organising socially across different barriers and boundaries, that are forming NGOs and social movements and popular campaigns, that the world's citizens and global society can develop and can influence policies. And that through developing global civil society, we can then challenge the politics of conflict and particular interests and nationalism. And she would see global civil society as an alternative and as an important structure and a framework in which we can develop politics beyond states, and we can develop different understandings of democracy. So, if you're interested in these discussions about how we can do politics beyond states, cosmopolitan politics, without those barriers of being forced into divisive and particularist territorial communities, this book is probably the best book to get out of the library or to look at. This is an edited collection, edited by Archibugi, A-R-C-H-I-B-U-G-I, Daniele Archibugi. David Held who I've already mentioned, H-E-L-D, and Martin Kohler, K-O-H-L-E-R. Anyway, the book is called Reimagining Political Community. That's quite a good title for the book, because the point about cosmopolitan democracy is really that it is about reimagining political community, about how and where we do our politics, and how different interests can be recognised and given voice. And in this book, apart from those guys that are editing it, there's also stuff by Andrew Linklater, Richard Falk, and other people. It's quite an excellent collection of different academics on different issues about how the world might be organised differently and how order and justice might be achieved beyond the frameworks of liberal representation operating within inside states. So, you could crudely, there's quite a lot to say and there's not very much time. So, one way of looking, there's different ways of looking at cosmopolitan democracy, and I'll probably give you two possibilities. So, as I said in the beginning, we can situate this discourse as being largely a discourse of the 90s that we've moved beyond in certain ways with some continuities. So the way that cosmopolitan democracy was understood in the 90s was as a liberal discourse. Whereas we understood traditional international relations and traditional understandings of order and justice, they were understood as sort of realist. So you do IR theory stuff anyway. So that was understood as realist or pluralist, where each state pursued their own interests and all the rest of it. And cosmopolitan democracy, because it was arguing for the reimagining of political community, and was arguing that we need a universalist understanding of democracy and the protection of rights without these artificial boundaries of sovereignty, it was sort of understood as a liberal discourse. That it was saying really, even though they said that they weren't saying this, that it was saying that we can domesticate the international sphere, that we can make the international sphere no different from the domestic sphere of the state, that we could transform our understandings of equality and universality and progress from the sphere of the domestic state to the international sphere. And that was generally understood as a liberal framework. However, as I've already sort of indicated, there's quite a critique of traditional classical liberal understandings going on as well. There's a critique of the division between the domestic and the international. There's a critique of the division between the public and the private. There's a critique of traditional electoral forms of representation and majority rule. So you can sort of see it in two ways, really. Either you can say this is a liberal challenge to realism, or you can also read it as a critique of liberalism and liberal understandings in political theory. Now, in terms of how so that's one thing for you to ponder. They're often called liberals, these cosmopolitan Democrats, and they often call themselves liberals, these ones in the 90s that we've been looking at. We might want to think about exactly how we might use those words and how we understand it. Now, in the 2000s, we're a bit more disillusioned with what we call a liberal understanding of international relations. We're a bit disillusioned with cosmopolitan frameworks. We're a bit disillusioned with this sort of liberal universals that we think sort of extending our understandings of the domestic state to the international sphere. Whereas in the 90s we were very positive about welcoming a new global era, being one collective community, overcoming the divisions of the Cold War. In the 2000s, we think that our sort of hopes and dreams were a bit naive and a bit utopian, and that it seems that the inequalities and the hierarchies of power are still being reproduced, and that discourses of universalism, of humanitarian intervention, of saving other people or of developing them and democratizing them, we often think are actually quite divisive, that they set up a different set of divisions, a different set of hierarchies and exclusions, and these liberal universalist discourses are just an excuse for American imperialism or Western power or global biopolitical capitalism or other sort of forms of power that we understand as circulating in a more fluid and universalistic way. And we sort of think that power isn't based on states anymore in those little boxes, that power begins to operate globally in different frameworks. Maybe some of them you'll discuss in this module, or maybe not. But we tend to be a bit more disillusioned with this universalist, we're all part of one community, universal rights sort of discourse. So not many people nowadays would say, yes, I'm a cosmopolitan Democrat, I believe in the spread of democracy around the world, the West and liberal powers have the duty of taking law forwards. We're a little bit more cynical and a little bit more sceptical of that sort of thing that goes under the name of universal liberalism. But I would argue that cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics seems to have a different life, a life not of liberalism, but maybe a life of post-liberalism or post-humanism, where you could read books by Isabel Stengers or Bruno Latour, who would argue that we need a cosmopolitics which challenges liberal universalism, but takes on board a lot of those concerns, that argues that frameworks of representation aren't really adequate, that they produce exclusions and divisions, and that the cosmopolitan democracy aspects that rely on advocacy, of representing and thinking about the needs of others rather than powerful majorities, that thinking about politics in a cosmopolitan, collective way, not just based on power and hegemony, but based on different needs and our duties as cosmopolitan citizens, you can see that that develops in a different way, and often in a way that's not really called liberal, but is often seen as post-structuralist or postmodern or post-human. And you can sort of think about cosmopolitics or cosmopolitanism as an alternative way of constructing how we engage with global concerns like the biosphere and the environment, and that in order to engage with these concerns, that the competition for electoral power and domination on the basis of states or on other levels probably isn't the best way of doing it. People would say that if we're really concerned about the environment can't vote in elections, what we need to do is have more of a political say for scientists, for experts, for advocacy groups, for NGOs, that the way that we do our politics today, particularly bearing in mind the globalized nature of our world, the complexity of the different processes that we're involved in, our different identities, is that we should be moving beyond liberal frameworks of representation, and that we should be thinking of different and more imaginative ways of bringing in advocacy, of expertise, of law and of justice that begin to go a long way beyond our traditional liberal conceptions of order and justice. So in one way you could maybe understand this sort of 90s cosmopolitanism as sort of being defeated or rejected. But on another way, you could argue that it's been fundamentally successful in its opening up of a critique of these liberal binaries and liberal divisions and a critique of liberal frameworks of representation, and making us think about and reflect how in a globalized world we can think order and justice beyond our traditional frameworks. So, 12 o'clock, time to stop. Thank you very much.